So we are doing our social studies lecture for March 23rd, 2020. We are talking about the Roman Empire Part 2, continuing where we left off. Our standards for today explain the origins and sources of government systems. We're talking about that standard in specific today because Augustus did usher in a new governmental system after he did away with the Republic. Our I can statement, I can state who Augustus Caesar was and what the beginning of the Roman Empire was like. So let's talk about this. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He was a controversial ruler, to say the least, at least in regards to how we view him today. Because of his part in ending the Roman Republic, which was seen as being a system to try to stop one person from having too much power, but he overturned that and made a government where one person had all the power, namely himself. So controversial, of course, but on the other hand, he did have a pretty stable government overall. Augustus had a firm, meaning pretty stringent policies, pretty strict policies, like this is the way things have to go, but they were moderate policies. They were firm in how this is how it's supposed to be, but they were moderate, meaning they weren't too extreme. And that helped lay the foundation of a pretty stable government. So one thing he did is he left the Senate in place, partly to give the idea of republicanism, even though it wasn't really a republic anymore. He left the Senate in place, but he had a well-trained civil service in order to enforce these laws. One definitely positive thing is that men of talent were allowed high-level jobs regardless of class. It doesn't matter what class you are. If you are high talent, we are willing to take you. That's definitely something that would endear him to a group of people. He cemented allegiance of cities and provinces to Rome by giving them a degree of self-government so they could be under Rome, but they could operate on their own to a pretty decent extent, meaning that they got to operate their way for the most part, which helped them be okay with being ruled over by Rome. They had a degree of self to themselves. To make the tax system more fair, he ordered a census. And that is a vocabulary word for you guys. A census is a population count, counting the amount of people that live in a country or a nation. We have a census in the United States today. He ordered a census to make this tax system more fair. He set up a postal service and issued new coins to make trade easier. So he set up a postal service and issued new coins to make trade easier. And he put the jobless to work building roads and temples and sent others to farm the land. So if you didn't have a job, we could help you get one. You can build roads, you could build temples, and some of you could even farm if you wanted to. So he was willing to give people jobs if they didn't have them. Remember that there was a lot of chaos in the late days of the Roman Republic of people who no longer had occupations and were not doing well. So this government that Augustus organized functioned pretty well for about 200 years. One of the reasons why some people say Augustus was an all right guy, because the government that he established functioned pretty well. There were some pretty big problems, though. One problem, who would rule after an emperor died? So remember, about 500 years prior, they overthrew the Etruscan kings, and Rome did not like the idea of monarchy very much. So automatically, they didn't like the idea of power passing automatically from father to son. Kind of ironically, though, despite their dislike of kings, the emperors of Rome definitely had the power of kings. But more specifically, they really, really heavily associate kingship with the idea of power passing automatically from father to son. That would become more common in Rome later, but in this beginning period, that wasn't quite as common because there was such a distaste for automatically going from father to son. And this resulted in the death of an emperor, leading to violence or interest. The general population would have a level of interest about it. Some people would fight. There would be violence in regards to who would succeed. You can see right here a statue of Augustus Caesar, definitely portraying himself in a pretty regal manner. All right, so not all emperors are made the same, though, of course. Some were considered to be weak, and two early emperors were seen by some as being insane and or evil, depending on who you asked. I don't really like to use the word evil when describing historical figures. There were some it's hard for me to describe in any other way, but these two emperors in particular are not looked upon very well by history. Caligula, for instance, definitely on the side of what people would call insane. Appointed his favorite course as a consul. I mean, people don't really look too well towards stuff like that, I suppose. Very strange. Nero persecuted the early Christians of Rome, and he's been blamed for setting a great fire that destroyed much of Rome. Now, whether or not Nero actually set this fire is not known, but what is known is that after this fire, he definitely built a grand palace for himself on the rubble of former homes, which is not a good thing, and people would not look at that very well. So people got suspicious. We don't know, but what Nero did in the aftermath of this fire, even if he didn't set it, is not a great thing to do. Hadrian, an example of what people think of as a good emperor. He made Roman law the same for all provinces. That may not seem super important, but that encourages a great deal of stability if across Rome everybody has similar laws. And he had soldiers build a wall across Britain to hold back attackers from the non-Roman north. Marcus Aurelius, thought to be the last of the good emperors of that traditional era, read philosophy on military campaigns and was close to Plato's idea of a philosopher king. We talked about Plato's idea of a philosopher king being the ideal ruler of a society. Marcus Aurelius definitely encompassed that sort of idea. He wrote his Meditations, which showed his philosophy and commitment to duty. A quote from Marcus Aurelius: "Hour by hour, resolve firmly to do what comes to hand with correct and natural dignity." So resolve to always do what comes as correct and natural, but also dignified. This comes from the idea of Stoicism. To a certain extent, people think of him as being a Stoic. We're not going to talk too much about that philosophy, but Marcus Aurelius was definitely a philosopher king to that certain extent. He used philosophy to shape the way that he governed. And we can see some statues of these rulers that I just mentioned. We have Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, if you would, over here on the left. Nero, the one who's generally blamed for the fire. Caligula, the man who made his horse a consul. And Hadrian, over here on the right. So next, please go to Edpuzzle, where you'll be asked to judge whether or not Augustus was a positive force or a negative force. I'm very curious to see what you guys will think after watching this video. And after that, please do your quizzes that's assigned. Thank you.